So in this video, we're going to talk about a rule that we can use to determine whether or not a data point is an outlier. So far, the only way we've been able to say whether something's an outlier is just by sort of visually looking at it, either in a histogram or a stem plot or a dot plot, and saying, oh, well, that data point is far away from the rest of the data. But this is an actual rule that we can use to mathematically say, yes, we will consider this data point an outlier, or whether we will say, no, this data point is not considered to be an outlier. And it's called the 1.5 times iQR rule. So let's first talk about what this iQR business is. iQR stands for the interquartile range. And that is simply defined to be your third quartile, Q3, minus your first quartile, Q1. And remember, range, we talked about previously, that's just the minimum value versus the maximum value. So this is just a sort of special case of the range. Again, it's just quartile 3 minus quartile 1. So whether you've calculated those values or figured them out by hand, or whether you've gotten them from your calculator, you just need those two values to figure out what your iQR is. So once again, we're going to look back at this data on the number of games Wayne Gretzky played each of his professional seasons. And if you recall from before, or even if you don't, Q1 we already found to be 73.5, and Q3 we found to be 80. So if we're going to calculate the iQR, all we have to do is say, well, that's Q3 minus Q1, which in this case is 80 minus 73.5, and so that looks like 6.5 to me. Okay, so, well, great, we've got the iQR now, but what do we do? How do we use that to determine whether or not we have an outlier? So that's what we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, so there are a bunch of notes on this slide, so you might want to jot these down. These are the steps that you're going to need to go through to determine whether or not your data set has any outliers. So the first thing you're going to need to do is calculate the iQR, which is what we just talked about. Again, that is the interquartile range, and you find that by taking your quartile 3 value and subtracting from that your quartile 1 value. Then you're going to take that value of the iQR and you're going to multiply it by 1.5. And that just extends that range a bit so that an appropriate number of data points will still be included in your data set, and you're not going to be excluding an obscene number of outliers. Once you've multiplied your iQR by 1.5, you're going to add that value to your quartile 3 value. If you have any data points in your data set larger than that value that you get, again, that's 1.5 times the iQR plus Q3, any data points larger than that will be considered outliers. The very last thing you need to do is take that value of 1.5 times your iQR and subtract it from Q1. And any data points that are smaller than that will also be considered outliers. So let's go back to our Wayne Gretzky data, and we're going to see if there's anything or any data points in that set of data that we should consider to be an outlier. Okay, so I've just written out the data that we already are aware of for your information. So quartile 1 we already said was 73.5, quartile 3 we said was 80, and we already calculated the interquartile range to be 6.5. Now, if we take 6.5 and multiply it by 1.5, that gives us a value of 9.75. So that is our value for 1.5 times the interquartile range. So this is the value that we are going to be adding to our quartile 3 value and subtracting from quartile 1 to determine if any of our data should be considered an outlier. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to take 80, our quartile 3 value, and add on to that 9.75, the value that we got for 1.5 times our interquartile range, and that gives us a value of 89.75. Now, if you notice, our maximum value in our data set is 82. So that means that we do not have any outliers on the high end of our distribution. So let's check the lower end. Quartile 1 is 73.5. We're going to subtract from that 9.75. And that is, the cheat here, that is 63.75. Now notice we actually have two data points that fall below that 63.75 threshold. We've got a 45 and a 48, which you might have already been able to guess that those are outliers since they're so much lower than all the other data points. But because they fall below that 73 or 63.75 threshold, we have officially proven that we can consider them outliers. So in this case, for our Wayne-Gretzky data, we have outliers at 45 and 48.